from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I am most pleased to welcome you to an 8-week series. Last year we brought you a 12-week series on a topic called Journey Through Time. This year the emphasis is going to be from a different approach. The sub-area of that topic would be the historical human quest for the good life. And during this 8-week series we're going to talk about 6 quests that humans have had, one dealing with nature, one on freedom and justice, one on equality, one on the family, one on economic security, and finally on spirituality. But before introducing the first program, I want to thank, first of all, the Idaho Humanities Council for a very generous grant that's made this lecture series possible at North Idaho College in this TV series, along with the North Idaho College Foundation, the Associated Student Government at North Idaho College, and the Convocation Series at our institution. With all of these organizations and with their generosity, we're able to bring you this exciting series. On our first program on the historical human quest for understanding and interacting with nature, we want to welcome to our program a historical character that was with us last year, but not in this particular approach. I welcome Major John Wesley Powell, who is being played or portrayed by Dr. Clay Jenkinson. And Dr. Jenkinson is a Rhodes Scholar and is often described as the modern Chautauqua movement leader in the United States, and he is really a master at this field. But today, we want to welcome you as Major John Wesley Powell, who lived from 1834 until 1902. Major Powell was an American geologist and ethnologist who was the first to classify American Indian languages. Major Powell taught at Illinois Wesleyan University. In 1896, he and 11 others were financed by the Smithsonian Institute to explore the Green and Colorado River canyons, and Major, you're probably best known for that journey. But again, you had further explorations conducted for the federal government in the 1870s. You're an author of books, and on behalf of our panel, Major John Wesley Powell, we welcome you to the program to start this 8-week series.
Thank you.
And I'm very pleased to have our 2 regular panelists to go with us on this journey through time. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I shall ask Janelle Burke to commence our questions with Major Powell.
Major Powell, what a pleasure it is to have you here today. Can you tell us, how would you want to be remembered?
I think I am remembered as the first person ever to float the Colorado River through its canyons, including the Grand Canyon. That was 1869. But that's not how I wish to be remembered. I wish to be remembered as a scientific realist who argued that we mustn't carry the institutions and practices of humid agriculture into the arid West, that what works in Iowa or Ohio does not work in Utah or Nevada, and any attempt to impose a kind of Jeffersonian agrarian vision on that arid region will produce disaster.
Well, you are very involved with water then, as I hear you saying this.
Absolutely. I believe strongly that the West should be classified before it's developed, and that no parcel of ground should ever be sold without water rights inhering in it. That alienating water rights from land is a profound mistake in arid regions.
And do you have something to back that up? Have you traveled in that region? I know you said you floated the river, but what led you to these beliefs?
Well, partly history. If you study ancient Iraq, if you study Egypt, irrigation civilizations almost always end in despotism. It takes giant government or giant corporations to make massive irrigation projects possible. The problem is that both of those are antithetical to American principles. The American principles, as I understand them, were articulated by men like Jefferson, that we have certain rights to equality and that we aren't going to create a class system, and that big government is the worst thing that can happen to a freedom-loving, self-governing society. So that was one area. And then secondly, I saw what was happening in the West. If you don't classify lands before you begin to develop them, the lucky and the clever and the corrupt will find the future dam sites and the future irrigation canals and buy them first, and use the corrupt doctrine of prior appropriation to monopolize those water rights, so that if there's a township of land and the creek runs through Section 12, but not the other sections, whoever owns Section 12, in a sense, is the master of the county. That's, I think, a very inefficient and unreasonable way to develop the West.
Steve Shink.
Major, you're clearly a very well-educated man. Are you self-taught, or do you have a formal educational background?
A little of each. I'm basically autodidact. I don't have a degree of any sort, although I was able to teach at several Illinois colleges. I was schooled in the public schools of Jackson, Ohio, such as they were, and then when I was about 8, a local man named George Crookham realized that I was languishing in the school system and that I was being actually persecuted for my abolitionist principles. Ohio, though it was part of the North, was not favorable to the abolitionist movement. So he took me under his wing and made me his tutorial student, taught me to love nature, taught me to ramble in it. He put great books in front of me like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire and Hume's History of England, and he took me seriously as a young mind. I think that mentoring moment is critically important to men of success. So thanks to him, I became a very well-educated man, although almost entirely self-educated.
There's so much more about your background that I'd like to ask, but at the risk of being rude, I'm going to ask a question that I'm sure is occurring to our audience as it has occurred to me. You're a well-known adventurer. Is the loss of your arm something that occurred during one of those adventures?
Well, in a sense, I lost this arm at the Battle of Shiloh during the Civil War. I immediately joined the 20th Illinois Volunteer Infantry when the war broke out, and I distinguished myself as an architect and engineer of fortification. I actually won the support of John C. Fremont for my work in fortification. But then at the Battle of Shiloh on the 6th of April, 1862, an almost spent mini ball from a Confederate rifle entered my arm just below the elbow and shattered it. This was an age before anesthetic, and there was really no science in the field to put back together an arm so badly mauled. So 2 days later, on the 8th of April, 1862, I sat and watched while an Army surgeon sawed off my arm just above the elbow. For the rest of my life, I didn't let this disability get in my way. I used to cradle my arm in my other hand because the nerves began to regenerate after a time, and there was a tingling and sometimes shooting pain in the arm. And the second operation I had late in my life actually had doctors draw the nerves physically out of my arm. That was, I believe, the most pain that I ever suffered. But this happened in the war, and after the war, I had to choose between becoming a sedentary invalid or a man of adventure, and the more interesting path seemed to be to let my other arm take charge.
Major Powell, with Steve Shink's question, we indicated that you were involved in the Civil War. Many people who have studied your life think of you as the geologist and all of which you were, but not your role in the public policy or the political process or the Civil War. You were an abolitionist, and would you share with our viewers some of the concerns you had and some uncomfortable experience you had from those who opposed your position?
Well, as a boy, I was bullied on the playgrounds at Jackson, Ohio by those who hated the abolitionist movement. My father was a stern, morally high-principled Wesleyan preacher and an absolute abolitionist, and I was too. That's why I joined the Illinois infantry so quickly when the war broke out, because I saw it not as a sectional conflict, but a war of national moral regeneration. And after the war, unlike many, I did not hold the South's lost cause against the Confederacy. I believed that national reconciliation was important, and I actually withdrew from a Northern veterans club because I felt that that might be divisive. And I had no right arm, of course, and I found a Confederate officer who had been at Shiloh and had lost his left arm there. And as my little commitment to national reconciliation, each Christmas for the rest of my life, I bought a pair of fine leather gloves and sent him one. So I tried not to let the war get in the way of my spirit of adventure, and that this was the world's leading nation for science and for justice. So that was the abolitionist movement up until the war. I saw the war coming. I had made a little lyceum tour of southern states, and even in the North, I saw that the war was virtually inevitable.
Schmelberg.
Well, you've talked a little bit about the war, and that was a real turning point in your life, as I understand it. Can you expound on how the war affected your philosophy?
Well, it disillusioned all of us because we had held the notion that America was unique, that there was something exceptional about this nation. We were better blessed, we were more rational, we were an Enlightenment nation. And suddenly we're killing 1 million young men over issues that not everyone could even understand. So it was profoundly disillusioning. And furthermore, it stirred up all sorts of virile energy in the country, and suddenly it ended. And that energy was still alive. And my own view is that the destruction of the American Indian tribes of the American West, in some regards, was the momentum of the Civil War carrying itself to a new arena. And so was the economic exploitation of the West. So like so many others after the war, I found myself drifting to the West to study it and to seek adventure. But mine was to be a scientific quest, not a quest for power.
But you were involved with human beings as well as with geology and those kinds of things. What did you do with other persons?
Well, my activities in the West had several different focuses. One was my pure adventures, running the Colorado River twice. I made 30 such trips. I mapped the Uinta Mountains and the Henry Mountains and so on. So that was pure science, or at least adventuring science. I also was an ethnographer. I created the U.S. Bureau of Ethnography and studied native peoples. I knew that progress was coming, that it was inevitable, and that it was good, but I wanted to capture these tribal ways before they disappeared by assimilation or destruction. So I learned many Indian languages. I could read and speak about 12, and I spoke 6 very well. And I spent time with the Utes and the Paiutes and other Western Indians to study their religions and their politics and their languages and their social philosophies. And I became one of the 4 or 5 most important ethnographers of the time. So that was a secondary. And then I became interested in policy. I wanted our science in the West to be civilian rather than military, and was able to bring that off. And most important, I wanted our treatment of the Indians in the West to be reasonable rather than haughty. I felt that we were asking Indians to do something impossible. We were giving them reservations that could not support them, and then condemning them for not being able to support themselves.
Steve Sheen.
Major, if you had the opportunity to redraw the map of the American West, what would it look like today?
Excellent question. It would not look like Colorado and Wyoming and Utah. There would be no square states. The West was largely unsettled, at least by white people, when I first explored the Colorado in 1869. And I felt we had a unique opportunity to recast our development patterns to face the fact that the West is rugged and the West is dry. In short, it's not Ohio. And instead of simply imposing the Jeffersonian system, however brilliant and rationalistic it was, on a land that couldn't accept that matrix, I wanted us to use science to determine what would be a useful way of parceling the West. And here were some of my ideas. Instead of square blockish states of the kind that Mr. Jefferson proposed, why not watershed commonwealths? Each watershed region would produce its own little republic. This would make for much more sinuous-looking Western states as opposed to the square ones that you went ahead to develop. Secondly, no parcel of land would ever be sold without water. So instead of the rectilinear survey grid creating a kind of chessboard pattern, every farm or ranch would have a small little access avenue towards a stream or a lake. So it would be much less square and rectilinear. And third, we would prohibit one watershed region from ever raiding the resources of another. Each watershed region would have its own resource sovereignty. Every ranch would be at least 4 sections. There would be no 160-acre or even 640-acre ranchsteads. But all the farming that would be done in the West, with very few exceptions, would be irrigation farming. And my belief is 160 acres is too much for irrigation farming, that we should reduce those allotments to 80 acres. But most important, I wanted to study and classify the West before we opened it to settlement, so that our settlement patterns would be realistic, would be reasonable, would resonate with the science of the thing, and most important, so that they would be just and equitable, so that monopolists wouldn't go in first and take the best sites and then use that power against prospective settlers.
Was it greed or an honest difference of opinion that determined that your view of what the West ought to look like was not the view that was accepted?
Well, I think that's a wonderful question, and it invites, I think, an answer somewhere between the two. Yes, the history of the West is the history of almost unbearable greed. And the men who tried to destroy my career as the president of the U.S. Geological Survey and the head of the U.S. Bureau of Ethnology were bent upon opening the West to men like themselves, entrepreneurs who felt that the West was theirs for the taking, a resource to be exploited. People like William Stewart, the senator from Nevada. So there was that element. There were also preservationists like John Muir saying the West was too beautiful to be developed. So I had to find my balance somewhere in between. And it seems to me that, like it or not, there's a fair amount of simple inevitability in what happened in the West. You have a very materialistic, highly acquisitive sort of people with resources and means of transport, and you have a whole continent to play with. I think even if I had been given more authority, it would have been difficult to stop the mass migration of exploitative peoples who were moving into the West. But it could have been managed better. And that's the thing. You must always follow the dictates of science and not let politics serve human greed, but rather let politics respond to the usually clear signals that nature and reason give us.
Thank you.
Major Powell, you contributed in so many different ways, and on the program we have seen a number of those examples. But another thing that you did that was of such encouragement in our times, almost the end of the 20th century, as we look at you, and sometimes we think of how can you take some of the tragedies that happened to you physically and accomplish what you did, which was remarkable for any person.
Thank you.
As you went down and explored the Green and Colorado rivers. To make that point, and there are people like you that are extraordinary and special in the history of humankind and the journey through time, give us some indication of how really challenging physically that was, how rugged that trip was, and some particular highlights for viewers who might not have read about that venture.
It was a 100-day journey between May and late August of 1869. There were 10 of us on 4 wooden boats that I had made in Chicago to my specifications, and then transported on the Union Pacific out to the Green River. The men were all amateurs. Most of them had some connection to the war, but I was the only one with any scientific pretensions. And many people thought that it simply couldn't be done. James Beckwith, the mountain man, had said there's a great suck in the Colorado River. It goes underground and will destroy you. Others believed that there were demons in the canyons. That was the view of most of the Indian tribes. And most daunting to me was the notion that the canyon might hem in the river and go over a giant cataract of some sort from which no vessel could survive or be let down by ropes, and the current would be so swift that there would be no turning back, and so there would be a kind of death trap somewhere in the river. Well, none of those proved to be true, but we didn't know that until we had made our 100-day run. The great difficulty of the expedition was food. We had a terrible accident just 16 days out, and fully 1/3 of our provisions were lost. One of the boats, the one called the No Name, unfortunately went over a difficult rapids and was crushed on rocks. So we were suddenly in a dangerous position on food at the 5% mark in our journey. And the truth is that by the time we finally came out at Grand Wash Cliffs outside of the Grand Canyon on the 30th of August, 1869, some of us were in some process of starvation, and several members had scurvy. So there was that, and that was quite difficult. Because I was a one-armed man, I didn't have to help with the portages or the heavy lifting. I used that time to climb the canyons and to geologize or to take barometers to study the heights of the canyons. And on 2 occasions I became rimmed. I got myself so far up the cliff wall that I couldn't reach any higher, and I couldn't go back down, that I was stuck. And the only way I could come out of it was to be extricated by someone else. If I'd had 2 arms, I might have been able to do it, but one wouldn't serve. And on one occasion, my friend, George Bradley, unable to reach me from below, went up above, but it was 15 or so feet above me. And I was beginning to weaken to the point that I might cascade half a mile down to the chasm when he took off his overalls and made a kind of crude rope with them and let it down. And now I had the very unfortunate opportunity either to die where I was or to let go of my grip on the wall and reach out and grab that set of overalls. If I missed, it was death. If he dropped me, it was death. If the overalls had been destroyed by their repeated dunkings in the river, it was death. Well, fortunately, he lifted me to safety. But there were a number of incidents. We were swamped again and again. I think Bradley in his private journal said on 29 separate occasions, this is the worst rapids that we are ever likely to see in the Colorado River. You can never anticipate how many more there will be and how much fear, how much simple fear sets in when you are 3/4 of a mile into the depths of the earth. There is no possible way of climbing out. The rapid you see before you looks like a death trap, and you have only one way to get to civilization, which is to go over that rapid.
Knowing as the challenge that would be ahead of you and with your intelligence about geology, I'm sure you must have thought that you probably would not make it. Under those circumstances, why would you take such a challenge, knowing that death probably would be ahead for you?
Well, once you're in the river, there are only about 3 places where you can get out. So, in a sense, once you've committed yourself to the journey, you may as well do it. And secondly, I had a lot of confidence and believed that it could be done. I never felt that I would die. I always felt that we could do it if we were very, very careful. We didn't go over all the rapids. We let our boats down with lines. We portaged all of the heavy equipment. We took every precaution that can be taken. But once in a while, we had no choice but simply to go over like corks and see how we came out. Well, we had become quite proficient at this towards the end. But there was a crisis when 3 men left us and climbed a mile up the canyon wall to the north face. And they said they were leaving us not because they didn't like us, but because they knew that this was a suicide. It turns out we were only about 30 miles from safety, but we couldn't know that as the first people who had ever been there. So when they left, my heart sank, not only because I hated to see the expedition fracture in this way, but I felt that they probably had a very rational reason for deserting. Well, then we had no choice, the 6 who remained, and we popped over those rapids, which we later called separation rapids, in 90 seconds. And we survived, although we were wet. We fired our rifles to bring back the men who were leaving us, but they didn't hear us or chose not to hear us. And on that occasion, on the night before the desertion, I paced up and down the river for the entire night, and I said, maybe I should climb out. There will always be another chance. But then I thought, no, I have been waiting my whole life for this adventure. To think that there is a part of the canyon which I cannot explore, having already almost accomplished it, is more than I can bear. And I determined to go on, and I went to each member of the expedition and woke him up and said, vote. And fortunately, 5 others voted to stay. 3 decided that they were adamant about leaving. We went on. And 3 days later, we came out at Grand Wash Cliffs, and I was a national hero. If I had climbed out, I might have died, as did the 3 men who were killed by Shivwits Indians. Had I climbed out, I certainly would not have become a national hero. And I used that heroism not to line my pocket or to build my career. I used it to make sure that Congress appropriated monies to study the West scientifically. So, in a sense, this was a pivotal moment, and I made the right, although somewhat reckless, choice.
You remind me of what Franklin D. Roosevelt said later, and maybe from people like you he got the message when he encouraged American people with his statement that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And so you certainly demonstrated that you could overcome that.
We had fear. When you are a mile in the earth, and you are hungry, and you are tired, and there is a fractionalism amongst your troops, and the flour, the little flour that was left was brown from repeated dunkings and moldy and lumpy, and our bacon was green, such as we had it at all, and all of our sugar was gone, and all of our dried fruit was diseased, and the men were clearly in a state of panic, bordering on irrationality, bordering on madness almost. That's fear. We called it the Great Fear. And the second trip was an anticlimax 2 years later because, of course, you can't fear when you know how it's going to come out. So it was exhilarating, but I'm not sure fear is necessarily bad. When you've been in battle in the Civil War and you've seen a surgeon saw your arm off with a handsaw, I think fear ceases to take on the kind of role it does when you're a librarian or a school teacher somewhere.
Yes, thank you. Janelle Burke.
Our time is going to get rather short, but it's been so interesting to hear about your adventures. What was life like among the Indians?
It was extraordinary. You know, most ethnographers went west with military escorts. I never did. My view was, if you go there without an escort, they will respect you because you are showing trust and hospitality. And if you go there and learn their language, they will tell you their stories. So I tried not to judge Indians. I have a stage theory of civilization, which I think goes back to the whole theme of your forums this year. My theory was that all civilizations begin in savagery, they rise to barbarism, then they rise to civilization, and they end, if they are lucky, in a republic. But when I use those terms, savagery, barbarism, civilization, republic, I do not have any moral judgment whatsoever. Savagery is an honest state of primitiveness, and we move up these stages inevitably if we have the right moments and the right technologies. But we are not to judge Indians for being Stone Age peoples. We are to study them, help them where we can, but not harm them, not expect from them something that they cannot produce, and not judge them for being at the stage that they find themselves. So my relations with Indians were highly successful because of this trust that I had and this willingness that I had to take their view. I said once, when I see an Indian standing by the fire doing his medicine, I feel no judgment. In some regards, that is as meaningful a religious act as a Eucharist in a Catholic church. And as long as you keep that in mind, never forgetting your own superiority as a culture, you will, I think, be a good ethnographer.
On that note, I have to bring our program to conclusion. Major John Wesley Powell, thank you for being with us and starting off this 8-week series. Again, we'd repeat to our viewers that you lived from 1834 to 1902, and I also express thanks to the panel for questioning you on this very, very exciting life that you lived. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, and we will do part 2 of this 8-week series that is entitled Journey Through Time, the Historical Human Quest for the Good Life. I also today want to recognize that it was Dr. Clay Jenkinson that was portraying Major Powell, and Dr. Jenkinson is a remarkable scholar, a Rhodes Scholar, and also truly the master of the Chautauqua Society movement in this country at this time, and he'll be back with us again next week in the role of Thomas Jefferson. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.